I wasn't born into power, money, or privilege. My life was simple: wake up, work hard, and keep my head down. I believed if you gave the world your honesty and dedication, it would repay you with respect. But I was wrong. The people I trusted most, the ones I built my dreams with, were the same ones who ripped everything away from me. It started with whispers behind closed doors, small lies, subtle looks. And then, the betrayal struck like lightning. I was framed for mistakes I never made, accused of things I would never do. Overnight, I became the villain in a story I didn't even write. Friends turned their backs. Colleagues smiled to my face, but sharpened knives behind it. Even family began to doubt me. It wasn't just the loss of a job, or money, or status. It was the humiliation that burned deepest. Do you know what it feels like to walk into a room and see people lower their voices? To hear your name twisted into something ugly? To feel every dream you built crumble into ashes while the guilty ones walk away free? Laughing? At first, I broke. Nights of silence. Days of numbness. I questioned everything. My worth, my choices, even my faith in humanity. They wanted me crushed. They wanted me erased. But here's the thing about pain: it doesn't just destroy you. Sometimes it forges you. And in that darkness, a fire was born inside me. A fire that whispered only one word: revenge. I didn't want quick revenge. No. That would be too easy for them. I wanted them to feel every ounce of betrayal, every scar of humiliation, every second of helplessness they gave me. So I waited. I planned. I became invisible, moving like a shadow, watching their every move. Because when my time came, it wouldn't just be justice, it would be the kind of downfall they'd never forget. And this is how it all began. Pain is a terrible teacher, but a precise one. It taught me where they were weak, what they feared, and how they made their mistakes. I stopped being the person who begged the world for fairness. I became a student of their habits. First, I rebuilt the parts of my life they'd smashed. I took small jobs, saved every coin, learned to listen without reacting. I learned to smile when I needed to and to disappear when it mattered. The humiliation that once broke me turned into study material. I watched their patterns unfold like bad choreography, which lies they repeated, who covered for whom, and where they left crumbs of arrogance. Information is power. So I gathered it quietly. I went back to places I'd been banished from and posed as a harmless passerby. I reconnected with the one or two people who hadn't turned on me, the ones who still remembered who I was beneath the rumor. From them I learned names, dates, and tiny secrets: the private loan they hid, the contract clause nobody read, the habit of deleting uncomfortable emails at midnight. I learned how to build a web that looked fragile at first glance, but could hold the weight of a fall. My plan had 3 parts: expose, dismantle, and reclaim. Expose meant taking the first truth out into the light in a way that stunned everyone. Not a shout in the street, but a surgical reveal, one that could not be shrugged off as spite. Dismantle meant hitting their alliances, piece by piece, weakening the scaffolding they used to hide. Reclaim meant taking back what belonged to me: my name, my dignity, the life I had been stripped of. I started small. A whispered correction at a board meeting that planted a seed of doubt. An anonymous tip to an auditor that nudged a routine check toward a minor discrepancy. A discreet message to a journalist who liked stories about corporate hypocrisy. Each act was a match. Alone they were sparks, but together they promised a blaze. They never noticed how careful I was. They were loud animals, used to praise stirring at their feet. Their arrogance was the perfect blindfold. They assumed their enemies would roar. They didn't expect silence that worked like a trap. When the first crack appeared, it looked almost accidental. A client questioning a figure in a report, a partner insisting on seeing original paperwork. Then the audit found a signature out of place, not mine but tied to one of them. Panic spread like spilled ink. Suddenly the people who had paraded around me as winners were confessing confusion, blaming clerical error, pointing fingers. I didn't rush in to gloat. I let them flail. I let their tongues tie themselves into knots. They accused each other in private calls that were too loud. They eliminated loyal staff who had become inconvenient. Every decision they made to cover themselves only dug the hole deeper. But even as they stumbled, I stuck to rules I had set early. Never be cruel without purpose, never destroy a life for sport, and never let the truth be confusing. My aim was clarity. Make the facts undeniable, make the consequences proportional. My revenge was a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. Still, revenge is never clean. There were nights when my chest tightened and the memories clawed at me. There were vulnerabilities I hadn't counted on. Old friendships that still wanted me to forgive, a sibling who reached out with real tears. Those moments threatened the plan, tested my resolve. In those small human failures, I was almost myself again. I almost forgave. But then another betrayal surfaced, deeper and uglier than the first. A lie that had corrupted more lives than mine alone. That was when the cold resolve returned. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about stopping a pattern that ate people from the inside. So I pulled the final strings. I released evidence not to a single outlet, but across channels, auditors, former clients, a trusted journalist, and a quiet whistleblower platform. I timed everything for maximum clarity. Documents on Monday morning, testimony on Tuesday, internal messages on Wednesday. The week became a storm. They tried to spin. They hired lawyers. They pasted smiling faces on statements. But the facts leaned like a tower, heavy and immovable. Reputation, once a fortress, crumbled because it had been built on sand. When the last of the pillars fell, the silence that followed was the kind that filled a big, empty room. It was what I had wanted. Not barbaric triumph, but space to breathe. For a moment, I simply stood back and watched them face what they had made of themselves. I had begun as a broken man. Now I moved forward like someone who had been through fire and come out forged. I had one last thing to do. Reclaim what was mine. Not for vengeance alone, but to show that truth still belonged to those willing to find it. When the press arrived, they asked for spectacle. They wanted the dramatic arrest, the public showdown. Life is rarely a neat scene, though, and truth rarely obliges a camera. What they got instead was slow and unstoppable. One by one, contracts evaporated, boards demanded resignations, and clients wrote letters that sounded like eulogies for trust. They watched as their allies distanced themselves, not out of mercy, but out of self-preservation. A few tried to bargain. Most were gone. I didn't attend every hearing. I didn't gloat when someone cried in the courtroom. That would have cheapened everything. My revenge had never been about point scoring. It was about restoration, fixing the ledger that had been bent out of shape. In the weeks that followed, quieter victories came. Apologies arrived where they felt deserved, some sincere, some not. A few people from my old life reached out and asked, "How did you know?" I smiled and said, "I listened." But justice is not always full. There were people who escaped the worst of it, slipping through legal nets or hiding behind corporate veils. Some nights that thought clawed at me, a reminder that not everything can be balanced by one person's will. That sting remained, a dull ache that taught me humility. What surprised me most after the storm was not relief, but a strange, awkward gratitude. I had been given a chance to remake a life. I used it not to become a reflection of the people who hurt me, but to create something different. I started small enterprises with people who had been overlooked before. I invested in honest leaders. I taught others how to spot warning signs so they wouldn't fall the same way. People asked if I felt lighter. In some ways, yes. The weight of humiliation had been lifted. But in other ways, I had traded one heaviness for another. The responsibility of making sure my actions did not create new injustices. That was a burden I accepted willingly. There were brief moments of temptation, to revel in the downfall, to savor the proof of victory. I allowed a sliver of that. Mostly, I let the work of rebuilding take over. I learned the names of new employees. I answered emails at odd hours. I listened deeply. Years later, when I walked past the building where it all began, I felt neither triumph nor bitterness. I felt like a man who had visited the edge of himself and survived. The people who had been my enemies were shadows in windows, continuing their lives in whatever shape they could salvage. Some changed. Some didn't. Life is a messy ledger. If there is a lesson I would pass on, it is this: revenge that's only about breaking others is hollow. Revenge that includes reparation, truth, and a commitment to change can transform not just your life, but the lives of others. My victory was not only theirs falling, it was that something honest took root where deceit once grew. And the final truth? The thing that once defined me no longer did. The story that people would whisper about me in years to come would not be the one they wrote during my low days. It would be the one I chose to tell after the ashes. A story of learning, of quiet patience, and of building a better life on the ruins of a rotten one. I had wanted them to feel what I felt. I did more than that. I turned the hurt into a tool, and then put that tool to use building something that might prevent the same ruin for someone else. In the end, the fire that had burned me became the light I walked by. They thought they buried me. They had only planted a seed.